Hi, Misha here, and people really enjoy the AK videos, and I really enjoy making them, but now that we've kind of covered and recovered and re-recovered the few new guns that have come out so far this year, like the Sam 5 and the various Burils, not a whole lot new to talk about, at least until the Zastava M90 comes out. So I thought in this video I would kind of answer and way expand upon a question I get often. There are a lot of underfolding, side folding, and collapsing stock AK variants out there. And if I have, say, an Arsenal Sam 7 SF or a Vepr 12 with a folding stock, people will often ask, can I replace the stock with a fixed stock? Or sometimes they'll ask, can I take a fixed stock gun and install a folding stock? You see what I'm getting at. How interchangeable are these? And oftentimes the answer is not really. But that's not always the case. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the various stocks that fold, collapse, otherwise, that you can find on AKs. I'll do my best to show you several examples, but I will absolutely not be able to show everything. And so we'll kind of begin with the general, and then we'll get more and more specific as we get deeper into the video. So for general question and answer, the first part is for you. To begin with, I've kind of split folders into three basic categories: underfolding, right side folding, and left side folding. And the first AK folders were all underfolders, from the original AKS, AK47 Type 3, through the AKMS, and even to some made today. There are pros and cons to each of these stocks. The pro is with the underfolder, nothing hangs off the back. You have maximum compactness. And because the stock's width is split pretty evenly amongst the sides, it doesn't really expand the width in a bag about that much. So that's good. You also have two arms, so it's reasonably sturdy. But the downside, many people find the underfolding stock uncomfortable to shoot and complain a lot about it. Another thing, you have a very specific rear section. Now in the original mill guns, which we'll talk more about the variants in a minute, you had a very specific receiver. With the later stamp guns, you actually have a specific rear trunnion. So you're pretty well stuck with an underfolder. Of course, you can cut and modify, but I'm just talking about without bringing out the power tools. Also, because of the way it folds to the side, it makes a scope rail, a side scope rail, difficult. There are ways to get around that. Yugoslavia is a good example of how they did it, but yeah. Now we come to the right side folder. And this stock style is quite interesting. For one thing, it was never actually used in Russia. It actually started in East Germany and was copied by Poland, as you see here with this Tanto, as well as Romania, Egypt, and a few others. So we fold to the right, which is good. It means we have the left side free if we want to have a scope rail. But what's really useful, what militaries and manufacturers liked, this rear section goes into a standard rear trunnion. So it's totally interchangeable with a fixed buttstock of wood or polymer, doesn't matter. The downside, you have quite a bit of stuff hanging off the back, so it's not near as compact as it could be. You only have one arm. Many find the fact that it's quite narrow to be uncomfortable. And, well, yeah. There's a lot of criticism of this stock. A lot of people don't like it. It just depends, and kind of each variant has its own individual pros and cons. But if you buy a fixed stock gun, you can easily drop on one of these. It only has 2 screws. And if you buy a folder like this, it's easy enough to pull it off and put on a wood stock or a polymer. So that's probably its biggest thing, is interoperability. But instead of doing the right side folder with the standard Trunnion, what Russia went to with the AKS-74 and later AKS-74U, the Krunk, and of course the newer AK-74Ms, was this left side folding stock. It does much the same as the right side folder, but on the other side adds a little bit of width. What's kind of interesting about this original metal style here, it's lighter than our previous other 2 styles, so it actually saves on weight. And you can still have a scope rail, at least with, but of course you can't keep an optic mounted while the stock is folded, so it's a compromise, but it works pretty well. This style of stock does tend to give better cheek weld, and I would say of the 3 basic styles here, this is the one that people find most shootable, most comfortable. It also has very good lockup. The underfolder here is probably your wobbliest, especially the original AK Type 3s. Your right folders tend to be pretty tight, and these tend to lock up very well thanks to the system. The only problem is this one is very dedicated to a very specific receiver and rear trunnion setup. So if you get a gun that has a left folder, you're pretty much stuck with a left folder, even maybe more so even than an underfolder, because you just don't have a lot to work with. The only good thing is it's easy to drive the pin out and actually swap the type of stock, going from a solid to a metal or something else. Whereas on like an underfolder up here, it's more work if you want to swap the stock out, and your options are even more limited. So it has a little bit more interoperability there. And there are variants in the pin diameters we'll talk about in a minute as well. But yeah, this is what Russia still uses today. This is the style used in Romania today. And Yugoslavia has had a love affair for a very long time with the original underfolding type, so some might still be found in Serbia today, I'm not really sure. So I hope that kind of answers the basic questions. You really can't change between these 3. Whatever you get on your gun is what you are stuck with. Again, barring gunsmithing, of course. I'm just talking to the average buyer here. But with that, let's go from the general to the specific and talk about a few different styles of the underfolding stock. I know this makes me a bad AK collection completionist, but the truth is I, at this time, don't have a milled AKS Type 3. Just never really have hung on to one, never really felt the need. I have milled guns, but they are fixed stockers. But anyway, with that said, this gun here, the Wasser 1063 underfolder, which is based on the Romanian PM65, uses the original style of stock. Romania made the PM63 fixed stock, which was an AKM with a stamped receiver. They never made a milled gun in-house, although they issued them. But they kept on using the original style of stock here. And by that I mean it's machined. Later, Romania would go to a tube version with a push button in the back where the sling's at here. And it's kind of loosely based on the German MP44. Excuse me, MP40. Do it here. This is the disadvantage of being alone. You know, it unfolds. You know how underfolders unfold. And you'll notice it has a pretty steep descent from the thing here. And an easy way to identify one of these stocks in a picture is that it's smooth. They don't really have riveting except for the butt plate. One neat thing about these butt plates, they have a spring detent. You can hear that kind of keeps them folded down. I've always thought that was interesting. And if you look on the inside here, you can see machining where there are lightning cuts that scooped it out. Yeah, Romania just kept on using this original style, even when the rest of the comm block went to the new style with the AKMS up here. This is a Polish kit build, but it's pretty much an exact copy of a Russian AKMS. And you'll notice right off the bat, this is square and it has rivets. That's because this is made from stamped steel to kind of go along with the whole stamped AK vibe. It also has a much straighter angle. It still does come down, just not as much as the original style here. And the butt plate no longer has the fun detent. And there's one other very major, very important difference between these two, and actually is what makes them not interchangeable. The original type here, you'll notice it's just smooth on this side. It has one locking lug, or one locking thing, with two locking surfaces, and that's on the opposite side where the push button is. That means this side is simply a hinge. And as you can imagine, locking asymmetrically only on one side can lead to problems. So with the AKMS, they went to the same type of locking on the opposite side. And since it's kind of put in the design, it's external. So you can tell an AKMS dual locking stock by the right side versus this. That's why if you look at the Arsenal SAM7 UF, the milled underfolder, it has the newer style of AKMS stock, even though it's a milled gun, with the secondary locking lug giving a total of 4 locking surfaces. Kind of interesting. And even if you look at the SAS M7 Classic that Arsenal used to sell, it would appear to have this type of stock, original AK Type 3, but instead of being made from machined steel, it's actually stamped steel. So it's a ersatz stock, which actually kind of brings me to a somewhat unique variant. The one found on the Chinese Type 56-1. Originally, China produced a licensed copy of the AK Type 3 with the milled receiver, but with their quasi-AKM variants, they were reverse engineering. That's why their stock is kind of a little of both. No spring-loaded detent butt plate, even though this is smooth with very few rivets on the stock arms. This is stamped heavy gauge steel, and it does have more of the downward sweep compared with the AKMS stock. And also, it has the standard smooth right side with the locking surface only on this side here. So essentially, it's kind of similar to the Arsenal SAS M7 stock. It's stamped, but has the features of an original. Also, one thing that's kind of interesting, let me show you here. Whereas your stamped guns, even the Romanian there, have a square back cut receiver, this still has the kind of double angle slant back of the original milled gun, even though it's a stamped receiver. I don't know, just the small differences like that I enjoy. And it also has 2 rivets really close together That is pretty unique for for the Chinese. And it's a style of stock they stuck with pretty much all the way through Type 56 production. Just as Romania stuck with it too. Now, of course, there are plenty of other minor variations. Yugoslavia has produced many different types of underfolding stock, but mostly it's rivet placement and clearance for the safety. The Hungarian underfolding stock is slightly different too. Could bring it out, but I think the point's been made. I don't want to make this a 5-hour video. It's already going to be long enough as is. And with that, let's go away from our underfolders and go to side folders, and let's start with right side folders. Why not? And the first of those, that's at least commonly known and available, is on our good old AMD 65 from Hungary, made by FEG. And this was a unique design. This was not based on anything the Soviets were mass producing. And it was designed to make this gun as compact as possible. Folding over to the side, it actually is thinner than where the charging handle is, meaning that it's not effectively expanding the length of the gun out. Has a rubber recoil pad, even has a little rubber bumper so it doesn't mar up the receiver. And it has a push button down below here to release the stock. And this is a pretty tight locking mechanism in both positions. And it was actually quite successful for what it was, and didn't add weight or size to the gun. Of course, this is when you start really hearing about people complaining about not really having a place to put their cheek or even chin. It is a relatively thin bar, and it does kind of swoop down low. Probably not the absolute strongest stock in the world, but it seems to get the job done. It is made of steel, but it was designed for a very specific purpose. And it also requires a specific receiver, trunnion, and shell itself, with the hardware down below here. And so this stock is pretty exclusive to the AMD 65, and would remain really the only side folder for a few years, but of course not forever. And now we can bring our Tanto back out to talk about that right side folder we mentioned in the beginning. This stock actually started in East Germany, who introduced it around 1972, so they could basically make one gun and just put whichever stock they needed, fixed or side folding, on it. And apparently it was a good idea and relatively affordable. It was copied by several nations, with Poland having a pretty close facsimile on their Tanto here. It uses the same screws for the fixed stop here and here. Although, I mean, not the same screws, but the same screw holes, I should say, on the Trunnion. Machine screws, because it's into metal. The rear screw is very short, though, so not a lot of durability there. But it also has a bracket that slides on and goes around the pistol grip nut to reinforce it for things like, say, rifle grenade launching, which certainly Poland was into. Of course, the downside is you have that block and the lever hanging off the back, unlike the AMD, which makes everything nice and compact and the buttons more concealed. And these can get a little loose, although this one's plenty tight. And again, chin weld is about the same because we're using essentially the same type of metal tube. And this is probably one of the most common folding stocks you'll see because you can just buy them for various guns. And again, they were copied by several nations. And here we have the Egyptian Mahdi. Originally, Egypt produced the AKM with a great deal of assistance from the Soviet Union, from Russia. But once relations fell apart around 72, they switched over to East Germany. And initially they would just get some folding stocks from East Germany, and then they would start making their own, but they would simplify it quite a bit. Now the block inside is much the same, including with the lever here, but they would make this pretty much a straight metal piece. Versus the curve. And as you can tell, they would go to this stamped butt plate and flaring here to support it. Cheaper, easier to mass produce, and uniquely Egyptian. Speaking of, by the way, they bought spare parts for some other AKs from WBP in Poland in more recent years too. But many others would copy these besides, and of course the most famous is, because we have so many of their guns as well as parts kits in the USA, the country that made the right side folder famous was Romania. Yeah, it started off East Germany, then would migrate to Egypt, and around the same time Poland was working with their copy for the Tanto, so it was Romania, to include on this gun here, their 545, known as the PA86. And the stock would soon appear on an updated version of their PM63, known as the PM90. But they would simplify it. It no longer had the bracket that attached to the pistol grip inside here. The block was simplified. And for this version, we have a push button situation. That's said to be for their domestic guns. But for export on guns like the AIMs and whatnot, the aimer, you would continue to have a lever similar to the original style. And of course that would require some changes here. Just a slightly different lockup system. So there's two basic variants of the Romanian simplified folder. They would often cant these off to the side so that it would kind of run straight. And of course with the PA86 they would up the cocking handle to not interfere. But yeah, this became standard equipment on many of their guns. And it's probably a good idea they simplified it for more mass production, because they would use it on a lot of guns, a lot of models. Here it is deployed, the push button. And it was probably made quite famous by the aimer, what we know as the Draco. This one has the lever style, the export style, but it could have the push button if Romanian military issue. There was an earlier stock that folded to the left that had an integrated block before anyone mentions it. It's an interesting critter, but it was pretty flimsy. It's kind of a combination of an AMD 65 system with an underfolder but single strap. Anyway, it's a thing. But this was the one they really settled on, and it would be on the PM90 short rifle, which would have a 12.5-inch give or take barrel, and the folding stock would be standard. And again, for export, these were known as aimer, AIMR, and these would have the lever style, whereas the domestic guns would have the push button. Makes sense on a short gun like this, but they didn't stop there. As you know, they used it on their RPK light machine gun too, known as the PM64 originally. These would be produced up until they're being replaced by the 545 version. And yeah, it uses the push button style stock. Now, It's a little bit different internally, so it can work well in the 1.5 mil receiver. And it could just be me, but I've always felt like the stocks we found on these AES-10Bs that came with them, as well as the parts kits that AOA had, they seem just a little bit heavier gauge steel. Not by much, but they feel a little bit heavier. Like when I go to unfold these, the stock feels a little bit thicker, but it could be my imagination. Regardless, what isn't my imagination, they issued both caliber RPKs with that stock, which let them keep a standard rear trunnion. And Romania is still very much producing this type of stock to this very day, which they're about the only country. I think there are some commercial versions still being made in Poland, but Egypt no longer makes AKs. East Germany no longer exists. So with that, let's look at a couple of oddball right side folders, and then we'll move on to the left. Surely taking inspiration from the AMD 65, we have the Chinese Type 56-2 folder, often called the Bakelite folder, although the stock is mostly metal, which is the center compartment being the synthetic material. Work began in the 70s, but because of various issues, this really wasn't ready till either the very late 70s or early 80s, by which time the Type 81 was around, although they did kind of borrow the stock and use it on a few later guns. It, as you see, it does fold to the right. It requires its own special receiver and trunnion with a little bit of a block sticking out. And it's pretty quick to deploy. Locks pretty tight. And it has a nice large push button on top. It's pretty short though, which some might not like. On the other hand, it can house a cleaning kit in here. It's, I think, yeah, the first folder we've looked at so far today that can house its cleaning kit. All the rest don't have space for it. But yeah, that's certainly one of the more unique folders around. Let's look at another one, a little bit more modern. I'm talking, of course, about the original side-folding burial stock from Poland, which maybe on the surface doesn't look like it was inspired by the original wire type, but it really was. In fact, its bracket, the reinforcing bracket, is kind of straightly copied from the East German design via the Tanto. Folds to the side, shrink wrap rubber butt plate. You can, let me show you before I fold it. There's a push button here to fold it on the side, but to unfold it you can just fold it out like that. Again, it's a little short, but the nice thing is, like the Tantal's stock and the PA86, it does just fit into a standard rear trunnion, so there are advantages to that for the military. Very sturdy lockup, but FB hasn't made this type of stock in about 10 years. It was the original style. And with that, folks, we've kind of looked at a majority of the right side folders. There is one more, but I actually want to talk about it in the section designed for the left. So why don't we go ahead and jump back in time to the early 1970s. So while the satellite states were kind of going to right folders, generally speaking, Russia was working on a new pattern that would fold to the left. They had their reasons. We already talked briefly about it. This is an original style here on this SLR 104. One thing to note, these used a 4.5mm hinge pin. And the back of the receiver, as well as the trunnion, is angle cut, so it properly locks up. Of course, our latch is in here. And this is a stamped, very lightweight, but actually still quite durable folding stock. Now, there are variants of this stock. There are the kind that have the rolled edges and a ribbed butt plate. And there's this type that's all smooth. And then there's a Bulgarian version that's kind of both straight edges but a ribbed butt plate. But basically they're all the same stamped steel type stock. And yeah, this does really well. It was made for the AK47, the first 545, and then later on it was copied in Bulgaria by Arsenal, although to be fair, a lot of their stocks were Russian, just, you know, reworked there. But they were about the only ones, racking my brains, at least for a military, that actually made their own left 5.5 pin side folders. By this point, yeah, though, the Warsaw Pact is going in different directions. So it's pretty much a Russian and Bulgarian stock design. One neat feature, these stocks are known for nice tight lockup. And the reason is, you notice how the side of the latch here sticks out a bit, some more than others. It's designed to stick out a bit so it can wear in. If it's all the way in or even recessed, then your latch is worn and you might get some wiggle. But as long as it's sticking out, it's keeping pretty much constant tension on your stock, which gives you pretty solid lockup. They also introduced this reinforcing plate over the pistol grip just to protect it in case it's dropped while folded. But generally speaking, this is a great stock. It saves on weight, makes the gun very compact with no blocks hanging off the back. The only real downside, it does make the gun wider because the stock folds over to the left side, not the right side. So you still have a charging handle plus that. And you can still have a scope rail, but not a scope on it if it's folded. And you could fold it over a bit, I suppose, but it would stop before going all the way. Yeah, this was a good stock, but it wasn't actually the first left folder. No, we would actually get our first left folder not from Izmash, but rather Molot, with the original RPKS, with wood stock. So there was a left side wood folder. If you look at my older videos, you can see the RPKS folder that was built by Legion. And essentially this mechanism would remain unchanged to this very day, because this is my Vepr RPK74, which is a semi-auto RPK74M. The stock has a top and bottom tang with 3 screws, and there is a latch that you down in the back to release it. Sorry. Very sturdy lockup with a pin. This is not interchangeable with the AKS74 style, even though it's very similar. The only real difference between the original pattern and this is the original pattern did not have a lever here for folding it. Yeah, no lever here. Instead, if we flip this extremely heavy thing over, you'll notice a hole in the side, and that was for using a bullet tip to fold it. The idea was the folding stock on this light machine gun would be quick to deploy if a paratrooper or someone else landed, but it would require real effort to fold back up because they didn't want a machine gunner stock accidentally collapsing on him in the field. Probably was a bit overkill, hence why they added the finger latch later on. But yeah, the original RPKS and the later RPKS AK-74 and 545 used this pattern of stock. It was wood, then they would go to the quote-unquote plum color in the 80s, and then with the RPK-74M here in the mid to late 90s, they would go to so-called true black. But the mechanism has pretty much remained unchanged. But the only problem here is this is pretty definitive. This is pretty much it. There's no other stock to put on this type of hinge. But yeah, the first left folder in military service was probably the RPKS, so you might kind of understand where Ishas took inspiration with the AKS-74. And again, this style of stock would be used on the AKSU as well. And it would be carried forward. And now we come to the AK-74M, and thus, of course, things like this SGL-31 here. At first, you might just think they took the metal stock and replaced it with a polymer one. And generally speaking, you would be right, but these are not interchangeable. Even though this is a Bulgarian 104FR, this is a Russian stock set on it. And they drop right on, totally interchangeable. When they did the AK-74M at Izhmash in Russia, they made several changes. One that's not often recognized. Earlier I said there's a bit of an angle cut in the back here. You can see, hopefully, the edge of the pistol grip and how close it is to the edge of the receiver. If you look here on this one, you'll see that there's a little bit more of an edge. That's because they changed the angle ever so slightly of how the stock folds. Not a whole lot, just a bit. Another major change, and one that more are very aware of, is the pin. Bulgarian guns, just like the first 20 years of Russian, use a 4.5mm pin here. Doing the redesign, though, in Russia, they increased the pin to 5.5mm, as well as changing up the arrangement here a bit, beefing it up, as it were. So they're not interchangeable between the different angle cut and the different pin. 1mm is a big difference in this world. Now, one thing to point out with the SGL 31s, 94s, they don't have the reinforcing plate above the pistol grip. The military guns would. But yeah, Russia would go over to the 5.5 pin for the AK-74M, and this would be their new standard. But Bulgaria never had the, we'll call it the TDP, to make the 74M, so that's where the difference comes from. Of course, this solid body stock now has the ability to keep a cleaning kit in it, much like that Chinese 56-2 we just looked at. And Russia, Izhmash, would start using this type of stock on quite a few guns. Here it is on the Saiga 12. This is an SGL 1294. Same basic stock body as on the rifle. But you'll notice this has a metal butt plate with a button to release it, and the cleaning kit compartment. This, because, well, shotgun, has a recoil pad and then a little nipple you press in. And since it's rubber, no cleaning kit compartment. But once we unfold them, we'll notice the same 5.5 pin. And same basic angle cut to the receiver. This does have a strengthened, thicker front latch. For obvious reasons, because, well, shotgun. So that's kind of the big version. What about if we go smaller? Well, this type of stock was used on the Vityaz submachine gun, as well as the semi-automatic variant, the Saiga 9. Unfortunately, we don't have Saiga 9s in America, but we do have the KR9 and KP9, thanks to Kalashnikov USA, and these are very good, almost pound for pound exact copies. They even have the reinforcing plate over the pistol grip. Good stuff. And they use, at least on this one here, the metal version. So they did make a metal 545, 5.5 thing. And this one doesn't use the standard latch. Rather, you have to pull up on it. It's more of a tension thing. You can see why I don't fold this stock too frequently. There we go. It's easier to do when you're holding it right. It just locks onto the simple nub here. And the reason is, this is a shorter receiver overall. These have room and everything for the latch up front. For the 9mm, they went to this simpler alternative. It's just a smaller receiver all around. You can see the pin there. It still has the kind of dip down in the middle. The reason these have kind of a cutout on the pin, it's because in Russia they had a safety where you couldn't fire the gun with the stock folded over. That's a story for another day. But yeah, in a military stock, they wouldn't be that cutout. But still the 5.5 pin, standard release latch. So this is used on their submachine gun. And while the polymer stock is comfortable, in fact, the lockup is rock solid, you get just as good of a cheek weld. The only real downside is you can't have a scope on and fold it. Even keep your cleaning kit in. It is a little bit heavier. So I think that's why for this one they reverted to a slightly modernized take on the metal stock, because this is lighter. And it saves on parts, and I don't think they were as concerned about a really great cheek weld on a 9mm submachine gun or carbine. Well, while we're at it, there is another version of the Molot stock we can talk about too. This is the one that I think I get a lot of questions about, because it appears not only on the Vepr 12 shotguns, some of them anyway, but also many of their rifles, like the the FM4721, the FM7421, as well as the 30821 and the 5421. This is kind of Molot's commercial sporting type stock. Generally, it does use the same type of receiver interface here, but Molot's terminology, they call both pieces the trunnion, both the inside and outside hinge. This hinge is not really made to be disassembled, so if you were to put one of these solid body stocks in place of one of these, you would basically have to get both pieces. You don't see them separate too frequently, and they are a little different. So yeah, when people would buy these guns, they would ask if they could put this stock on vice versa, or put a different, like a fixed stock on. The truth is, not really. I mean, anything's possible, I suppose, but my advice is, if you get this kind, just be happy with it, because changing it out's not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, as they say. It does have this rotating cheek piece. It's kind of neat, with a nice rubber texture. This is steel with the overmold on parts of it, and then a rubber recoil pad. And the nice thing is, yeah, when it's folded over, it doesn't leave a block hanging out the back either. So I had to mention this. This is standard on the military's Vepr 12 shotguns, and it is on quite a few competition models over in Russia. But yeah, swapping between these would be problematic, and swapping between these and the one found on the AK47, virtually impossible. Speaking of, we talked about Bulgaria. What are they up to? Anyone ever heard from Arsenal? Let's check it out. Post-communist Bulgaria was quite interesting when it came to its AK production. Probably for a whole other video. And like I said, it originally had pretty much all the plans and everything to do the AK-74, AKS-74, AKSU-74. Before that, it had been doing milled guns. And so in the 90s and into the 2000s, it started making guns for all kinds of markets. And while Russia had progressed on with the 5.5 millimeter pin, Bulgaria kept on using the 4.5 and the AK-74 types. Even for guns like this 106CR and 5.56, even for guns like the 107s, to a greater or lesser extent, they're kind of made to AK-74 spec, hence the lightweight barrel. And that's why with like the 104FR here, you can very easily swap between Bulgarian and Russian metal stocks, but a Russian 74M stock won't go on. So what Bulgaria did, they made a very similar stock, but still for the original pin. Now, to be fair, most of these we find in America are your U.S. made ones. So even in Bulgaria, they're not that. But yeah, you'll see the AK-100 series type stock, but made for the original angle and for the original pin size. So you can swap them between these as much as you want. Quick comparison, our Bulgarian and again our Russian. Easy way to tell them apart is again how there's that step, that cutout up there. And again, not really interchangeable. Even if you tried to make them, the angles would be wrong. You'd have a stock kind of tilted up or down. Front latches are pretty well the same though. So it was kind of with this basis that the milled side folders would come in, and that's why I decided to save them for this section. Beginning with the AR-M1 in the mid-90s, Arsenal returned to the milled receiver, and that's really what their pride is. And they have done tons of versions, including several different stock styles. And this, of course, on this SAM7SF is the modern tubular side folder. Now it's on the right, but it's the same mechanism. If you look here, button, the hinge pin, mirror, literally mirror, so kind of flipped around. Here, the one from our stamped gun. Now the latch is a little different. Here's the original latch. Here's the newer latch, but actually the earlier SAM7SFs, the ones from like 2004, 2005 period, some of them did have the simplified latch. This extended latch came a little bit later. So they basically just, yeah, flipped it over. And you can tell that because it still has the same kind of locking tab over here, the little wedge pill shaped area. And so that's why it locks up so nice and tight. They even have a solid version for the milled. Now this block sticking out the back, that's standard. This is physically part of the receiver. It's installed at the factory before finishing's even done. I think they use it, A, so they can have the same basic receiver, and B, to give it a little bit longer length of pull. This is a pretty long length of pull, but people over 6'5" will probably appreciate that, I guess. They still do use underfolders too. That was kind of the early choice. And Arsenal has even done some kind of collapsing stocks, various things, although we don't get a version in America. I'm sure if people have made them, but that'd be a custom project. And this folder appears on pretty much any of their versions. This again is the 16-inch version. Our CR up here would be the 12.5-inch. Some of these with the milled receiver would have this stock, and even their AKSUs with their short 8.25 barrel will have this stock. You can see it on those SAM 7K, the Gambits, or the SBRs. So yeah, I just thought this fit in better because mechanically it's the same thing, just reversed to the other side. A benefit of going to the right is you don't have anything interfering with your scope rail, and you're not really adding much weight because of you're folding it over to the side where your charging handle's at. And that is what Arsenal's doing, amongst many other projects. So we've looked at folders. Well, at least have to give a little bit of token representation to collapsers. And I think the only AK I own with a collapsing stock is my Archer, or the Brill. This is a 4-position job. Similar, at least inspired by the M4, but it's a much narrower tube because you don't need a receiver extension, a buffer tube. Interesting, it doesn't fold and collapse, it just collapses, adjusts with 4 positions. Sure, that saves you a little length, but it was mostly done for soldier comfort, which is kind of the main thing of an adjustable stock like this. What you save on length of pull is pretty minor. Now this could fold, of course. There's nothing back here. They just, in fact, FB Radom even offered a folding version to the military, but they decided, nah, they were good with this way. Of course, on an AR, it cannot fold, at least standard. And this is what replaced the original right side folder you saw on the other Brill. Interesting fact, that right side folder, because it was introduced before the extended shelf, you actually can't fold it all the way with this safety down. The safety has to be up to give that other stock room to clear. I found that interesting, but it just goes to show you when these came in, the components together. A few other modern AKs have collapsing stocks, and some might point out things like the Galil Ace, but I don't typically consider the Galil Ace an AK. It's not because I don't like the Ace, it's actually quite the opposite. I have more respect for it than that, and so I tend to give it the respect of calling it its own thing. That may make sense, it may not. I just, don't really consider the Ace, the Galil or the Ace, to be AKs. They're their own little variant. And a few of the other modern ones. Of course, plenty of adapters can go into a standard rear trunnion to give you a telescoping, folding stock. Plenty of aftermarket options. You have your mag pulls. But I collect military stuff, and most of your AKs were made between the 1950s and the 1980s. And back then, they just really didn't have the kind of ergonomics and styling that we have today. By this point in time, most nations have moved away from the Kalashnikov. In fact, I've said many times that I think this is about as far as you can push the design and still reasonably consider it a Kalashnikov. Any more changes, and it's just not the same gun, frankly. The Arsenal SAM 7 SF, the AR-M9 is another good candidate for a modernized gun. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to line them all out here, kind of compare and contrast. And there are a few other collapsers I know, but not many in the AK world, because by the time this type of stock was in vogue, most nations had gotten rid of their Kalashnikovs. Well, there we have it. If not every single military AK stock type, I would hope a reasonable sampling. And I hope maybe that helped answer some questions. If you're looking at buying one of these guns, or owning one and wanting to change the stock. And if not that, hope you at least were entertained. I enjoyed making this. And kind of comparing. Folding stocks were always a specialty item, at least in the beginning, for paratroopers and vehicle drivers. Your rank and file would have a fixed stock with the AK47 and the AKM. But early on, the underfolder, when someone had to have an underfolding stock, was pretty much what everyone used and made. But again, with the AMD65, the idea of a side folder came into vogue, and a few years later, East Germany took that and made their stock, which many countries copied. And you have a few outliers like the Chinese 56-2. But still, folding stocks were mostly meant for special purposes, with a fixed stock being still the standard during the 70s and 80s. However, once we get into the 90s, in Russia, for the first time with the AK-74M, a folding stock was standard. And the same situation would appear in the West. This is around the time we start seeing folding stocks on Western rifles as standard too, or in the case of like the M4 collapsing stock. Of course, Germany had the G36, which was a folder. Some nations went the bullpup route, like say Britain and Israel. But yeah, it wasn't until the modern era when making the ability to collapse, to fold in, be a standard. This was because of mechanized warfare. Everyone's riding on something, a helicopter, a tank, an APC. Or everyone is potentially going to be fighting in more of a urban or close-in environment versus marching across plains and fighting in wide open fields. It just kind of goes to show you. It's also why barrels have gotten progressively shorter over time. But yeah. And to wrap this video up, I kind of laid out my favorite of each one. My favorite underfolder, I picked the Romanian. I like the milled style stock. It's not as strong by far, but I like the fact that it is machine steel. I like the angle, and I've always liked the detent butt plate. It's just neat. I don't know. This is the one I like. For the side folder, I really like them all. I could have easily said the 104 FR, but need to do a right folder, so in that case we'll say the AMD 65. Another import. This has always been a favorite of mine. It's just so neat, and it really did start the trend of shorter barrels and folding stocks. Before this, all AKs are basically 16-inch barrels, and again, the only folding stocks for the underfolders. And of course, you know, for the left folders here, I had to pick the SGL 31. Mostly because before these came into the country, no one ever thought we would get a true Russian 74M. And it's the modern style, which is neat. I don't know. And again, this is when the stock was standardized, and this just well done. This style of stock, again, like on the 104 FR too, they're just really well done. Very cool, very interesting in my opinion. So which of the three styles do you like best, and what do you think? And feel free to share stocks and types that I didn't mention in this video. And if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, again, if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.